All right, so we will move on to our next presenter. Make sure it's on here right. So Dr. Michael Vasalis is going to talk about the economic value of root collar excavation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. This part, like Sarah said, the title is The Economic Value of Root Collar Excavation, and it's basically part of the socioeconomic objective of the Armillaria Root Rod Solutions funded by USDA. I would like to start the presentation by a data set that I find very interesting from USDA. We can see here, if I make that work, yeah. Over the last 10 years, in the United States, the production of pitches has gone down. And there is a substantial decrease, right? You see we have the peak around 2009, and then all the way until 2018, 2019, production goes down. Now, I would like to make a parenthesis here. In terms of value, we don't see the same decrease. And this happens because prices, through some years, have been increasing. So although production goes down, some years the value does not have the same drastic decrease. Now the question is, why do we have this decrease, right? And pretty much all of you in the room will have some reasons. Based on the data I have from USDA, there are two main reasons. Reason number one, on that same time period, there is a substantial decrease in the number of peach tree orchards across the United States. So even if we focus only between 2016 and 2020, we see that across the United States, there is almost 20,000 acre decrease in terms of bearing trees. The biggest part of this decline happens in California, where it goes down for about 5,000 acres. Interestingly enough, in South Carolina, which is the second biggest state in terms of peach production, we don't see the same picture. We see a slight increase from 13,000 to 15,000 acres. A second reason is what Dr. Coates was mentioning earlier and what we heard yesterday from a number of speakers. There is a tremendous pressure on peach orchards from different diseases. For example, we have the peach tree short life, Phytophthora root rot, crown rot, Armillaria root rot. Now, we know from data and from previous literature that in the 1990s, peach tree short life was the main reason for the premature decline in the life of peach trees. Through the years, we have seen that Armillaria root rot has a higher impact, a higher negative impact on orchards, which leads us to the two objectives of the study. Objective number one is to estimate the potential negative impact on the profitability if Armillaria appears on our orchard. Objective number two, following Dr. Coates' presentation, is basically to find out the potential economic benefit of root collar excavation based on the data we have right now. Now, why we care about objective number one? For most of the other diseases that we mentioned yesterday, and most of the ones all of you know, we have enough data to evaluate the economic impact. The same is not true for Armillaria. At this point, although we have some evidence from different farms, like the one here at the Ridge in South Carolina, we see the negative impact, the devastating economic impact Armillaria has in case it appears in the field. We do not know exactly the economic impact. We conducted a phone survey, a preliminary phone survey using a company named Qualtrics, The survey included 55 farmers, half of them from East Coast, half of them from West Coast. And we will going to talk to you about the survey a little bit later on also. One of the questions in the survey was, we had a list of potential risk factors, and we asked producers, we asked the 55 farmers who participate in the survey, which of these they believe is going to be a threat for their orchard in the future. And we can see that all of the farmers, 55 of them, right, said armillaria is going to be, they agree or strongly agree that armillaria is going to be a big risk in the future for the orchards. Interestingly enough, armillaria is higher than climate change, right? And Dr. Gracie told us yesterday how much emphasis research institutions and the private sector put on climate change. And for good reason, because about 73% of the farmers who participated on the survey said climate change is going to be a big threat for the future. But armillaria had 100%, more even than labor problems, climate change, or even higher than bacterial spot. And these two reasons, the picture we saw before, plus why farmers are having armillaria as a big threat, explains why we need to evaluate the economic impact of armillaria root rot. Part of the survey, we asked the farmers to tell us about potential loss, tree loss they had over the last 5 years because of armillaria. Every farmer had some loss. Half of them had less than 10% of trees dying because of armillaria. The other half had about 11 to 20% of their trees in the orchards dying from armillaria. Now, with Qualtrics, we don't know which farmers they selected, right? So when we will talk to you later after Dr. Eckart's presentation about the survey, we would like your help to get more data because it's going to be important for us to estimate the economic impact of armillaria and have more detailed, more reliable data sources. Now, like Dr. Coates mentioned, I won't go in details about that. There are a number of different approaches to treat armillaria. We have chemical approaches, biological, and cultural approaches. For most of them, we know that they are either very expensive and/or they are not effective enough. That's where root collar excavation comes into play. We know that root collar excavation, like Dr. Gracie said, improves the potential life of the orchard for around 2 to 3 years if armillaria comes, if our orchard is infested with armillaria. We know potential cost for implementing root collar excavation, but what about the economic profitability? Does it make sense economically for a farmer to go ahead with root collar excavation? And that's why we had objective number 2. Now, since we didn't have, they like my presentation. Since we didn't have a lot of data, right, direct data from the farmers, what we did is we used enterprise budgets. If you're not familiar with enterprise budgets, basically extension agents talk with farmers and they create a budget with the cost and the revenue for 1 acre farm. And then we can extend the size of the farm. We had budgets for California, Florida, and South Carolina. Now, the South Carolina budget was developed a couple of years ago by Dr. Nathan Smith, and we will say it had some limitations, but again, that's until we have your help with the survey, that's the best data source we have. In terms of economic analysis, basically we use a typical profitability analysis that most economists do, net present value. We are going to see a couple of assumptions for that. And the last set of assumptions we had is we examined 2 different scenarios with armillaria. On scenario number 1, the orchard is infested with armillaria at year 5 of the orchard life, and we assume that every year a constant 10% of trees die. On the second scenario, we didn't have a constant rate of decline. Again, we started with armillaria appearing at year 5 of the orchard, but in this case, we had an exponential decline in number of trees that was randomly selected through the simulation from 1 to 3% every year. So we're going to see what is the impact of armillaria and the profitability for both of these scenarios, and whether or not root collar excavation makes economic sense. Here you can see some summary of what we obtained from these enterprise budgets. For this presentation, I will only focus on South Carolina. But basically, the assumption we had, we went with 100 acres, both for California, Florida, and South Carolina. The number of trees varied from 150 in South Carolina to 156 in Florida. And then at the bottom, you see the fixed cost and the variable cost. This cost and this information here does not include, right now, the cost for root collar excavation. Now, remember I told you that for South Carolina, we had some limitations. A limitation we had is the South Carolina budget did not include irrigation cost. So we had to make some assumptions about irrigation cost. Another limitation we had, and that's why I keep saying we will need your help with a survey, the California enterprise budget is from 2009, right? So this means the cost structure, the revenue structure they had is completely different because we have been, right, more than a decade after they developed their budget. The Florida budget is more recent. They developed it in 2017, 2018. So now talking a little bit about the results. Like I said, we use the net present value approach. We have a typical 4% discount rate, but we made the estimation also with 3% and 5% discount rate. On the first line, you see the net present value using the enterprise budget information we had before without any disease. So what we see is if everything is optional, all right, in an ideal scenario where nothing negative happens in the orchard, we have about $1,300 per acre profit. Now, scenario number 1, armillaria hits. We have the orchard infested with armillaria at year 5, and then every year after that until year 12, 10% of the trees die. You see that we go to a negative net present value. So just with these enterprise budgets we have, there is no question that armillaria has a devastating economic impact if the orchard is infected with armillaria. Now, if we do the root collar excavation with the assumption that we are able to extend the useful life of the tree by 2 years, we see that we still remain on the negative, but it's less negative. So in this scenario, we go to $1,900, approximately negative $1,900 per acre, but right, it's less negative, so farmers would like it. And again, we will need more information about the cost of the root collar excavation technique. Thank you. Appreciate that. Now here is the outcome on the second scenario. Well, remember the second scenario, basically the decline in the trees is not constant. We created that simulation on Excel. We ran about 10,000 different simulations, and the decline goes from 1 to 3% randomly every year. Again, armillaria is observed at year 5, and root collar excavation improves the useful life of the tree by 2 years. Now, compared to the previous scenario, we see that we went from approximately negative 2,900 to negative 2,500. So one observation here is depending on the assumptions we make or depending on the impact of the disease, the negative outcome can change substantially. On the other hand, you see that with the root collar excavation, net present value remains relatively constant, which is a good outcome in my mind, right? Because it reduces some type of variability, it reduces some type of risk. So at the end, again, based on the data we had from enterprise budgets, and the same was true for California, and the same was true for Florida, we see that if the orchard is infested with armillaria, there is a devastating economic impact. With the exception of California, but even with California, there is a huge decline on net present value, but they stayed in positive. Florida and South Carolina moved to negative net present value. The impact depends on the assumptions we make about the decline in the number of trees if armillaria infests the orchard. So when we made an assumption that it's only 3% per tree is dying every year after year 5, then the impact was not as big, the negative impact. Root collar excavation provides potential economic benefits, net present value improves, and on top of that, it reduces variability if we follow root collar excavation to increase the life of the orchard before armillaria is observed. I would like to finish this presentation by saying we will talk to you a little bit later about that, but for the farmers who are here in the audience, I hope we made a good case showing why it's important to get more data, more than these enterprise budgets, more than the 55 farmers we had. So later on, I will spend 5-10 minutes talking to you about the survey, and we would like your help on that. Thank you so much, and let me know if you have any questions.
With inflation now, you use a 4% discount rate, so probably you need to go 6 or...
Correct, yes. We will need to increase.
And that would make it even more beneficial, or...
It will make it more beneficial, exactly. Yeah, with inflation, the benefit will become even better if a farmer implements root collar excavation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.